Well, good evening, everyone. We have breaking news tonight. One of the most controversial voices on television, not to mention a fierce competitor and a pretty fair talent in both news and sports, is out of a job. MSNBC's Keith Olbermann, host of Countdown, the highest-rated program on MSNBC, out the door so suddenly a few there apparently didn't get the memo in time. The network was still running promotional spots with his face on it an hour after he signed off for the last time this evening. He closed with a story about being fired.
In the mundane world of television goodbyes, reality is laughably uncooperative. When I resigned from ESPN 13 and a half years ago, I was literally given 30 seconds to say goodbye at the very end of my last edition of SportsCenter. As God is my witness, in the commercial break just before the emotional moment, the producer got into my earpiece and he said, can you cut it down to 15 seconds so we can get in this tennis result from Stuttgart? So I'm grateful that I have a little more time to sign off here.
And he did take his time, thanking crew and staffers and reading one of the James Thurber short stories he reads every Friday night. Then he said good night and goodbye.
Chris Hayes filling in for Rachel Maddow on The Rachel Maddow Show is next. Again, all of my greatest thanks. Widen the shot out just a little bit so we can do one of these last time. Thank you, Brian. Good night and good luck.
Keith Olbermann signing off tonight. His former network releasing a statement reading, and I quote, MSNBC and Keith Olbermann have ended their contract. The last broadcast of Countdown with Keith Olbermann will be this evening. MSNBC thanks Keith for his integral role in MSNBC's success, and we wish him well in his future endeavors. Network President Phil Griffin also sending out an email to staffers, which we've obtained, outlining the new primetime schedule without even mentioning a mention of Olbermann. According to the New York Times, he still had at least 2 years left on a 4-year contract worth an estimated $30 million. Sources telling us the parting came as fallout from Comcast's purchase of NBC Universal, and with it, the departure of company head Jeff Zucker. With us now on the phone is Bill Carter, who's got the byline up right now on the New York Times homepage. Also on the phone, former MSNBC reporter and anchor David Schuster. And in Philadelphia, CNN chief business correspondent Ali Velshi. Bill, the latest, what are you hearing was behind the departure?
Well, NBC is being assertive in saying it wasn't related to the Comcast takeover. I do think there's been a long-standing issue with Keith. Obviously, he was suspended in November over the donations he gave to Democratic candidates, and at the time it was, I think, very close at that moment to him being fired over that. And this has been a long-standing issue. Obviously, he was an incredibly important talent to them, and really, I think he's responsible for their entire brand now, you could argue. But, Keith has had, long-running problems with management in his career, and I think this came to a head, and they both agreed it was time for him to move on.
Bill, what at least one source has told me from in MSNBC that Jeff Zucker was somehow sort of a protector within the corporation. His departure, that it's not a coincidence that Jeff Zucker has departed, Comcast takes over, and even before Comcast took over, there had been some talk within MSNBC about the corporate culture at Comcast being different and not tolerating someone like Keith Olbermann. Have you heard that from people within MSNBC?
I certainly heard that Jeff Zucker was a protector of his, for sure. There's no doubt about that. And I think, they realized for a long time that he was very critical to MSNBC. He was their highest-rated star. And clearly there's going to be a change in some way in the management. But I don't think Comcast is going to come in with some sort of heavy hand and say we're going to change MSNBC after they've established a brand that has made them, much more successful. They're the left-wing alternative to Fox News, and it's been their brand. I think they're going to be cautious about that. And let's face it, Rachel Maddow has become basically now the star of the network, and her opinions are no different from Keith's. I just think Keith is a different personality, and would he have run afoul of Comcast? I think everybody at MSNBC and NBC believed that would have been inevitable.
David Schuster is also joining us on the phone. David, you used to work at MSNBC. You had your own clash with management. What do you make of this?
Well, Anderson, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm shocked, and let me say from the outset that I'm a huge fan of Keith's work. He was always very kind to me, and I consider him a friend. And I think Bill's got it exactly right. I mean, you look at all of MSNBC's primetime, Rachel Maddow, Lawrence O'Donnell. I mean, they exist because of Keith, and Keith was essentially the fundamental building block. I just hope for Keith's sake that he's leaving on his terms, which it sounds like it was, in the sense that he was given time to say goodbye, and Keith is his own man. I mean, when Keith does things, he does things his way, I haven't always agreed with everything that he's done. He hasn't always agreed with everything that I've done, but I've always respected his work immensely. He is a brilliant man. He's a brilliant writer, and I found him to be a great guy to work for. And it's going to be I think it's going to be a certain loss for everybody who's involved in primetime at MSNBC.
David, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but I guess that's sort of my job in this case. I mean, was he well liked within NBC? I mean, I've heard plenty. What was your impression?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. I think the people that he worked with had a lot of respect for him, the people on his show, the director, the technical people, the sort of people that often get forgotten by major talent. Keith was very kind to them, the makeup artists, that sort of thing. I think as far as management, I mean, Keith, had his conflicts with management going back to when Dan Abrams was running MSNBC, and he had his conflicts with Phil Griffin. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that not only are things sort of changing with Jeff Zucker no longer running NBC, but the reporting structure. You now have Phil Griffin, from what I understand, is going to be reporting to Steve Kappas instead of directly reporting to the head of MSNBC. So Steve Kappas, the head of NBC News, will certainly have a much more influence over MSNBC, and this may be part of it. I mean, there was no secret that Steve was particularly upset, justifiably so, with how Keith handled the suspension earlier this year and the donations, and Phil Griffin took a little bit of a different tack than Steve probably would have liked. But yeah, I think you're probably seeing now either Keith recognizing, or certainly Steve Kappas influencing MSNBC a lot more than you would have had, say, a week ago.
Bill Carter, do you know, I mean, we mentioned this earlier, and I think it was you who was reporting it, but in terms of his contract, does he get paid for essentially, I mean, will they keep him off the air somewhere else if they just pay him out for the next 2 years?
The answer is that he will be kept off the air, probably not for 2 years, but for a sustained period of time. He can do radio. He can do radio. He can do internet. He can't do television. He won't be able to go on another television show. And this was a settlement of the contract. I think we should also point out that, Keith is one of the most outspoken guys you'll ever find. And if he feels like he was being dealt with unjustly here, we'll hear about it. I think we would have heard about it on the air tonight. I think he probably agreed to whatever this settlement is and feels okay about it, knowing that this was probably time for him to move on.
So, Bill, is it accurate to say he was fired?
I don't know. I think I haven't talked to Keith yet, and I think it's a little dicey. I think it's certainly true that they made a move to settle his contract instead of keeping him on the air. Does that amount to being fired? It sounds like a fire.
And he had two more years of his contract?
Yeah, I believe he signed a 4-year extension in 2008, so he would have gone to 2012. So he had this whole year and 2012.
Also, Ellie, sorry, go ahead.
To keep in mind about Keith with money. Keith has never really been about money. I mean, yes, he wanted the contract in terms of wanting to be paid what he felt like he was worth, but he's always said that he's gotten more money than he feels he needs. He's not a guy who's about money, and if he felt like, for whatever reason, that this was the time to leave, I guarantee that money is not an issue for him.
I just feel bad. I mean, I don't, I've met him just a handful of times. I don't know him personally, really, but for someone who clearly, has a strong opinion, it would be a very difficult thing, I would think, to be off the air, at such an important time in this country's history, David.
Well, yeah, yes and no, but I mean, he's gone down this road before. I mean, he's worked. He left MSNBC following the Monica Lewinsky scandal back in 98, 99. He was off the air for a period of time. He worked at CNN. He worked at Fox. So he's certainly gotten used to having his breaks in between his successes. And I guarantee, Keith is not done in the broadcast world. He's a very smart guy. A lot of organizations would be very wise to talk to him and to at least see, okay, what could he possibly do next, whether it's a radio show, whether it's a TV show. I mean, he's such a super talent, and he is good to work with, and that's a combination that I think will mean he's got a bright future regardless, and it'll be on his terms.
Ali Velshi is with us as well. Ali, as David mentioned, Olbermann was suspended last year for donations he made to some Democratic candidates. I just want to play some of what he said when he came back from that suspension.
I owe you 3 apologies. Foremost, for having subjected you to all this unnecessary drama. The White House is on the phone for you? Seriously? Another for not having known by observation, since it's not in my contract, that NBC had rules about getting permission for making political donations, even though any rule like that in any company is probably not legal.
So, even as he apologized, he did kind of find a way to criticize his bosses. That episode obviously put a strain on his relationship with MSNBC's management.
Yes. and a relationship that Richard and Bill have both pointed out has been strained for some time. The reality is that Keith Olbermann's been shopping around for his next job for some time. It's a fact that he's not happy, and while the FCC just approved that Comcast-NBC Universal merger on Tuesday, it doesn't seem that Comcast did use their heavy hand. It does seem that NBC, MSNBC and NBC and Steve Kappas and Phil Griffin might have come to the conclusion that their new bosses weren't going to sort of be as tolerant of Keith Olbermann's temperament, his mercurial nature. But the reality is it's probably more than likely that Keith Olbermann himself in some way or other precipitated this arrangement. Keith Olbermann has signaled for some time that he's been ready to move on, and the closure of this deal may just have been a precipitating event. But from what we understand, Anderson, no direct connection between the approval of the merger between Comcast and NBC and the release of Keith Olbermann from his contract.
We got to take a quick break. Bill Carter, though, before you go, is there anything else that you know that we should know?
Well, just that I think we probably will find out a little more in the future, because I can't believe Keith will be quiet about it. So I think we'll learn a little bit more about his particular view. He didn't really state it tonight, but I would be very surprised if he doesn't. He's a pretty outspoken guy.
David Schuster, anything from you?
No, I think Bill's got exactly right. Keith, on his own time, he'll come out and he'll make it perfectly clear what happened in a venue that he feels is appropriate. But again, I think we should be careful. I don't think this is the end of Keith Olbermann by any means. He's an incredible talent, incredible guy to work with, and he's going to be valuable to wherever he goes next. And it may be a period of years or whatever it is that he's got to sit down, but. Keith's outspoken enough, and a lot of people now would pay a lot, I think, to want to hear what Keith has to say. And so I think, I would be careful not to sort of write off his career at this point. Yes, it's done at MSNBC, but he's resurfaced before and he'll resurface again.
Talent finds a way. Bill Carter, David Schuster, appreciate it. Ellie Veloci, stick around. More